Welcome to Magic Without Fears, Hermetic podcast, Dr. Terry Burns.
Hey, how are
Thanks for,
you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm doing
Awesome.
great. And with most of my favorite guests, and you're among them, I'm always more nervous than I expect to be. So I'll do my best to keep it together. I fell apart on my Scott Stenwick interview on Inoki Magic. Just couldn't hold it to my excitement together and hopefully he'll let me do a round two with him one day. But
Oh,
again, with the people I'm excited to talk to because I'm so passionate about the things I study, it's just yeah, sometimes a bit
I just
chaotic.
want to say I really enjoyed your podcast. I've watched a couple of them and really enjoyed it, and I plan to watch more. And um, obviously my cat over here loves it too because he's crowding in on my space. So
Oh,
anyway,
that's great. I thank you. Yeah. Well, the idea was just to like how, it started during COVID, just to have those like try and have those long conversations that you'd have with your friends that would keep you up all night, that you'd get lost in and you'd forget that time was passing. And I thought, wouldn't it be cool if we just tried to have conversations like that? And it did take off. It took off, and I was very surprised. I'd tried
yeah.
podcast ideas and formats before, and they'd always crashed and burned. Though that
Hmm.
could have just been not having all day every day free as I did during lockdowns for 3 years.
Yeah. Well, there's that.
Yeah. Hopefully it was better in your neck of the woods than it was up in Canada, but it was pretty rough here. Yeah.
I know it was not a good time anywhere, I don't think. But that is I finally finished writing projects that I had on hold for years, so there was that. I mean, that was nice. But it was sort of a miserable time. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah. And that's why we're here is the writing project. You put out the new version of John Dee's Monus Hieroglyphica, and a lot of us have been familiar with this text for many, many years and struggled with it. Well, centuries people have been familiar with this text. John Dee's been beating kings and emperors and queens over the head with it for it seems like forever. And so I would love
yeah.
for people to hear a bit about what makes your translation and Dr. Turner's, who you did it with, so different from the ones that came before it, and what made you so passionate to spend over a decade of your life studying this.
Well, it could be, you have to understand, it could be because I'm nuts, but I'll give you the answer as if I was not, okay? Because I did get really kind of obsessed with it. And partly was starting out just with arrogance of, well, no one thinks they can understand this. Well, I can understand this. And by that time, I was so deep into it and I have a background in language and literature and all of that. But it also struck me that there weren't any good translations and things. Difficult texts don't make sense if you don't have good translations. And then everyone would say, well, and the Jostin translation. And C.H. Jostin was a brilliant, brilliant man. So, absolutely brilliant man. He was a curator of the museum at Oxford. I mean, but if you assume that something is something different than what you think, then that just doesn't make any sense. I was also just as kind of a side hustle, sort of into cryptography, and I was in this Voynich group. And there was a guy who always posted as Glenn Claston. He's deceased now. His real name was Tim Rahill, and he worked on such things. And this was like how he relaxed. And he's like, "This has got to be a cryptography text. It's got to be a cryptography text." But at that time, since you're telling your Golden Dawn story, I'll tell one of mine. When I first started it, I was also um, going through the order and noticing like this looks like what I just studied for a knowledge lecture. No, 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 it can't be that. Okay. Well, then we go get into Vincent Bridges stories because, of course, Vincent, who didn't have problems with lack of confidence, insisted that he understood it, and he wrote that outline. And so every now and then you are lucky when you trust a rather arrogant person and they actually do seem to know what they're talking about. So he had insisted that the first 10 theorems were about placements on the tree of life. Now from my academic background, I knew that there was this whole group of this insistence that, well, John Dee didn't know Kabbalah and da 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 da. But he says it's a Kabbalistic text, so that just seemed kind of ill-advised. If someone says, I'm going to give a Kabbalistic explanation, like, believe them. And hope so. I mean,
On the
I
title
also,
page.
yeah. So I mean, I also had a lot of luck, really, and I had everyone who came before me to stand on. And then there was also between the time that we did the first 17 theorems, um, and when we finished, James Egan's translation came out. And now I want to plug Egan's his explanation of sacred geometry and number. They're really excellent. His Latin is not excellent, and I don't think I would hurt his feelings because he says like, well, I don't know Latin, but here's my translation of Latin, and it's not not very good. But he was not looking at it as he was in terms of Kabbalah, he was looking at it in terms of numbers. So there was all this kind of stuff going on. Plus, I just love old languages. And then we could get into sort of weird deja vus. When I first saw it, I was like, oh, I've read that before. Who knows if I had or not, but that kind of carried me through a lot of craziness. And then I was working on Enochian stuff then with Alan. And so we we just kept going. And I did really deeply appreciate the support of William Kiesel at Ouroboros Press because I we kept, we were going to be done and going to be done, and we weren't done. And then finally COVID finished and we were done. But that may not be at all an answer to what you were asking, but that's the best I can do. I mean, I just got sort of obsessed with it, and I don't really like problems that I can't solve, even though, we can't like it still it frustrates me that there's those letters in 22 and we've got some of them, and I think what they show is just awesome. I mean, you reverse engineer it from Rosicrucian's things, as you of I have written back and forth about a little bit, but not knowing exactly what those Hebrew letters mean just drives me nuts. I did wonder, and this is the last of my Golden Dawn stories and my opening ramble here, but when you get to theorem 16, which is that LVX theorem, and it's the only known source we have for the signs of the adept used in multiple orders, I would, I've always wondered, like, doesn't that say this is important and it's important in terms of ceremonial magic? Like, why else would it be there? So that anyway, does that answer your question at
I
all? I
mean,
feel like it
I
doesn't,
love
but
it. I love it. You totally get what this podcast is about. This is exactly how we do it. We're just going to wander down different labyrinth ways, sometimes not even the same corridor at the same time, I'm sure.
oh,
But
cool. Here's to that.
cheers. The yeah, that passage in Hebrew that's
Yeah,
yet still unfigured outed
yeah,
is hopefully, I'll put it on the screen here. It'll just
yeah.
and hopefully folks can tear into it because I did. It's very interesting, and to reference another little translation issue in the text, it's not necessarily impossible,
Mhm. Yeah.
right? Um,
But no,
is it powerless or powerful that impossible was mistranslated as?
oh, it was so it's in the end of Ptolemy's Tetrabiblios, and it means powerless. And the idea is it's from astrologically powerless because there's not light coming in. And his whole thing is starting out with let there be light, the effect of light on transforming different things. And I mean, and that part is clear, like from theorem one on. So then when he picks this weird word that is in, I think it's chapter 24 of the Tetrabiblios, it's like it doesn't mean impossible. It means like, yeah, there's no light there because the light is blocked. So it's that source of light is powerless.
Yeah,
If you're
that was a
yeah,
very interesting video. Especially like how some of the videos. And for people who don't know, it's almost a 50 video course getting towards it. I'm hoping you
yeah.
hit 50, if not more.
So I'm actually wrapping it up, fingers crossed, tomorrow. So I think but then what I hope is sometime to just go back through because it did get too long. I mean, I was really optimistic when that started out, and I'm like, we're gonna have 24 classes. It's like, no, maybe we'll have
Well, so
24
that
classes.
goes actually to another point I was hoping for. Well, one compliment is you on some of the videos you just did them twice.
Yeah.
Um, and I loved that because I realized I'm watching the same thing again, but it's the same lecture given differently. Like no lecture is ever given the same way twice. And then you often had more information. I loved that it was like it just forced me to do lectures over again. And I
Well,
just
that's
went
because
through them a second. And
you're
I'm
just
just saying, I
awesome.
loved that
I
so
mean,
much because it gave perspective on things I'd already heard and new information about ideas that I was curious about.
what I thought was going to happen with that was I thought I'm going to get absolutely roasted with this. And you were one of the people, I guess, who was watching them because I don't think I ever left one up for more than a day. Well, there was one I left up for 2 days, and I was like, oh no, I got to pull that out because a lot of times, you're talking and you know what you think you've said, but you've said something totally different. And
Yeah.
like I got the elements in grade initiations mixed up in one. That was the one I was most alarmed about because a bunch of people had seen it already, and I really expected to get roasted. But I also thought, God, I can't leave that out there. That's just wrong. And you're right. You never do something the same way twice. So I thank you for being so kind as to actually enjoy that. Whereas I really expected somebody to say down in the comments, why did you repost this thing? So anyway,
No, I value whatever professors have to say, especially on subjects that I love.
well,
The LVX theorem
uh-huh.
I mean, I'm still in denial that that one's kind of true. Like it's and it's a willful denial. I want it to be true so much I'm going to resist it with all my might, just like the aliens that are flying around in the sky or whatever they
Don't
are.
do that.
Who knows?
Aliens are fun. Come on.
Balloons or blimps or floating buttons. I don't know what's floating around, but there's lots of things floating around in our skies. And yeah, uh the LVX formula and the letters, I mean, it makes sense that they're there, especially with the alchemical connections that we're gonna maybe save just for a minute because they're so exciting. But the idea of the hermetic idea of light, of light being a representation of nous or prima materia, it
Hmm.
makes sense that it would hold such a prominent place in Dee's understanding, given the literature and the material he's familiar with at that time. But again, to see that so starkly shown that these key Golden Dawn symbols and representative gestures and shapes are so deeply embedded in the Monas hieroglyph. It just seems unbelievable. And I would say, given that you were inspired by the knowledge lectures, it's very easy for the casual listener or observer to think, okay, well, someone read some GD knowledge lectures and then is engaged in eisegesis with the Monas hieroglyphica and is just seeing what they want to see in the text because they've had this lovely experience in the GD world. But 50 hours of videos plus over a decade of translating the thing and putting it out through getting it out through Ouroboros, which is, to call them reputable is, I think, an understatement. And
Oh,
it's too phenomenal. And you've really, right, if someone wanted to make these claims, some might say they require great evidence, and you've provided that in
well,
spades. And
well,
I
could I
just
could I
I'm
just say just two things about LVX because I I'm I'm glad that that seems like an awesome thing, but here's what helps. I mean, it helps being a geek, right? And being on a university campus. I have access to interlibrary loans. I had access to early English books online. And I had access to, years ago at the University of Florida, I ran into the Propoitomata Aphoristica, which honestly, like no one reads. I would expect if you're in his audience and you know this work, wow, because no one reads this thing. So these are 120 aphorisms that Dee did that came out a couple years before. Then the year after that, Dee has this compendious table of Hebrew Kabbalah, which is lost or something. But history of science people who looked at this Propoitomata Aphoristica, and I'm thinking of Wayne Shoemaker did the translation, but J.L. Heilbrunn was one of the big names in the history of science. And he's like, well, this is looking at the force that light exerts upon, cones of light. And he analyzed it in terms of conic sections. And that was one of the real jabs. And then because I'm on a university campus and we had like our union happy hour used to go out, and one of the math professors was there, and Nancy and I were sitting around at happy hour, and we were talking about that theorem and drawing out the LVX, and he was like, oh, that's a latus rectum. That's the most amazing mathematical transformation. Hats off to you, James Swenson. Thank you. And he showed that to us there. And so it was kind of the opposite thing, like, the beginner's mind thing. It's like if you don't know this is supposed to be difficult and you look at it and it's like, well, what is this going to do with parabolas? Oh, that's the most famous transformation there is. Let me show you. And so there was that whole kind of fusion going on too, which is you know. And Nancy, I got to tell a little story on my translator, Nancy, if I could.
Yeah, please.
Um, so Nancy has nothing to do with magical anything. She's a history of science person who is very good at Latin and very good at German. So before this, we translated Tuba Veneris, which we've since retranslated. But when we finished, um, she was like, Terry, did you know some people think this is an occult text? And I was, how could you not? How, and but but it was that kind
Awesome.
of thing. So working with Nancy on this, one of the things that she would do that was just awesome was I would also think, well, I know what this is. Look, and she'd be like, no, that's the wrong case. It can't be that. So she'd keep me from jumping ahead because she was looking at it more of history of science and math perspective. And so anyway, but we had a good time. When I finished, I was kind of sad after all these years. So then I started this thing. Anyway,
Yeah, well, did they ask you to produce a video course for it, or
no,
no? You just thought, what's next?
um,
And I,
I
I'm
actually
so
I
glad
have.
you did, of course.
Oh, thanks. Well, what I thought I was going to do, okay, and I talked to, I mean, no less than Pat Zalewski, who was really kind in showing, because I wanted to make some connections between some of the things in later Enochian work, some of the things that some people in some GD orders do, and he pointed out some of that in his writing, and he was like, "Oh, you ought to write a book on this," which was, it didn't occur to me anyone would want one. I was like, "Oh yeah," and then I realized that's going to take too long, and I've got other things I want to write, and we all, I'm at the age where I feel what time's winged chariot hurrying near or something. So it's like I'd really like to do that someday, but I'd rather like to get it out there now. So a friend of mine sort of challenged me and said, well, why don't you just do YouTube videos? And I was like, oh, well, that'd be simpler. I mean, one of the only things we got out of COVID was the ability to do Zoom videos on PowerPoint. That's how I taught my last classes before I retired. So anyway.
Yeah, well, it was interesting to see some of your earlier videos talking on Dan Winter's channel, which is what an interesting guy he is. And he's been on the periphery of my
Yeah,
awareness for a long time, but I don't know how to get into him. Let me put it that
yeah,
way. I'm sure there's a way, a
yeah.
channel. I didn't, anyway. But you mentioned on a few
Yeah.
of the videos I noticed with him to not show them to your tenure committee.
Yeah.
How was that
Well,
journey? Because there's a lot of occultists who are either consider young ones considering academia, or
yeah,
ones like me, like stuck at some point in the process.
yeah. Well, it depends on the country you're in, all kinds of things, right? Academia is a lot more tolerant in ways, and in ways it isn't. I mean, I think I know the comment you're talking about, because that was when we were talking about Enochian, and I was trying to keep my academic hat on, which does not work around Dan. Dan started talking about aliens and whatever, and I was like, oh shit, he's in trouble. Um, and so anyway, how did that work? Well, so it's kind of funny how that worked. Okay, history on most academic campuses is a more conservative discipline than English, languages, and literature, which is what I was in. I was the chair of humanities at UW Platteville, and we were philosophy, foreign languages, and English, basically. So
Wonderful.
I kept my occult interests. Well, first of all, I didn't really, they weren't a central part of my life until I met Vincent, which is its whole bizarre story. And then I tried to keep it in an academic framework. But oh yeah, there you go. That's the Ophanic Revelation. I did the intro to that, but those are a lot of his complete Enochian handbook from a huge Enochian working that was at Sedona in 1994. Actually, my fantasy now is to have another one next fall in Sedona that I'm trying to put together. Who knows if that'll come together. So anyway, I went along through things. I got tenure, and there was a big fight in my department about what counted for your tenure file and what didn't count for your tenure file. And so the way they settled it, academic departments are just dysfunctional. First of all, if you're not part of one, that's something the rest of you should know. They're just dysfunctional. I mean, you're with all these smart people, and you may be there for 20 years, and so you learn interesting ways to keep the peace. So the way we kept the peace was, well, once you get tenure, as long as you're publishing in a journal, it doesn't have to be in your area. And I was like, yes, okay. So then I started publishing in the Journal of the Western Mystery Tradition. And I don't know that anyone actually read my articles, actually. I know that when Nancy and I did our translation of Tuba Veneris, that she wasn't worried about it counting in their department because a translation of a text, it's like, yeah, well, I was in a language and literature department. So anyway, there wasn't really any issue there academically. The bigger issue that I had was in terms of family, actually. I mean, and that gets, I don't want to go into all the details, but basically I wound up in a divorce custody situation where the other party who oddly, I mean, we're good friends now. We were in, there's that magical thing of the only thing that binds you more than love is hate. I mean, we were having a hate fest and hurling stuff at one another in a really regrettable way. And so the idea was let out Terry's occult interests. So, you know,
Boy.
uh, gifts about witchcraft that Vincent had given my daughter became exhibit number whatever, and then UFO books became another. And I remember this delightful moment during the trial, which I won, by the way. But we had a very conservative judge, and I remember him banging the gavel and saying, I don't need to hear anything more in this court about UFOs. Half the country believes in UFOs. You have to show she was a bad mother. And I was like, oh, dude, thank you. Can I hug you? Oh, I guess I'd get contempt for hugging a judge. But anyway.
That's
So
amazing.
anyway, after all that drama, I did get to a point of like what I cared more about was harmony in my life and not upsetting my family members. And that can be difficult enough given the spin can put on things. But I didn't have any trouble in the academy after that. What I'd say is too, if you're interested specifically in the work of someone like John Dee, I mean, the big Cambridge critics don't have a problem with it, and Cambridge is a pretty decent school. So just cite what the Dee scholars are writing about, or Jennifer Rampling's work, if you want to bring something over this way. And you know, I'm sure since you're in Canada, about that great kind of subsection in, is it in Waterloo, where the Societas Magica people they have the academic study of magic. It's Penn University of Pennsylvania's
Yeah,
press
I
put it
I
out, but
didn't know that they're based in Waterloo though.
yeah, I mean they're, well, the Societas Magica isn't, and the that academic study of magic series isn't, but
Yeah.
a large number of the people that started it are there. So, like when we would go to the Medieval Studies Conference, which was my favorite academic conference because they're literally like, you want to do a paper on J.R.R. Tolkien? No one's going to say like, he wasn't in the Middle Ages. They're like, oh yes, he was a medieval scholar. We'll take papers on Tolkien. How about John Dee? Well, he drew on medieval magic. I mean, they'll let you talk about whatever you want.
Yeah.
So that's where Societas Magica had their biggest gathering, and I would say about half of them were, the people there were from that university in Canada. So
Very cool. I'm glad I
yeah,
found that out. I know the Societas Magica, but I had no idea it had a Canadian connection whatsoever. Um,
yeah, huge one.
yeah, that's interesting. That's very interesting. Yeah, and it's been interesting to watch over the last 25 years the shift in what's acceptable as university courses. I mean, I
Yeah.
believe you can get a degree in Taylor Swift now. Maybe that is a rumor, but if it's not true, it should be. Go
I
Team
did.
Tay. I don't know. I'm just saying things stuff. But my friend in 2003 or 4 started teaching while he was doing his PhD a course on demonology and rhetoric at the University of Florida. And
Yeah.
all the tenured professors and
Oh
everyone
yeah.
were furious because he doubled his class size. He had to teach it twice, which
Yeah.
so he made twice as much, I assume, of course, as well. And had his classes 2 set classes packed out for that course, and then the other professors in the field could barely get a certain amount. And
Yeah, well,
so
Florida's not where you'd want to do that now. I mean, the people I know there have been run out by their
has it
governor, but
changed?
that's
I guess.
cool. Yeah.
But it's interesting
But
to
yeah,
see just how these things change and shift, and people are the driving force, right? We can
right.
actually make an impact in these schools if we want to.
Oh, absolutely. Because really, what it usually comes down to is personality conflicts. I mean, I taught back at the early aughts, of course, in the occult and Shakespeare. Oh, our Shakespearean was upset by that. We did not have peace until I promised, like, no, I'm not trying to take away your Shakespeare course. Your Shakespeare courses are wonderful. They're also doctrinaire, Stratfordian stuff, wonderful. But it was more of a personality conflict. I don't know that he cared about the occult. He cared about me getting the Shakespeare course, which I had rudely assigned to myself since I was department chair. So that ticked him off. I could see why it ticked him off. But so it's like sometimes you just pick your battles. But then no one wanted to pick a battle with me since I was one of the people who also by that time decided on tenure files and say, oh, you're publishing more than any of us, but we don't like what you're doing. It's like no one wanted to pick that fight either. So my point with this isn't like that I'm so clever or not so clever. It's just that you've got to look at the human dynamic of it, and people in academia can be really mean and self-serving, and so you've got to find a way to step around it. It's been a lot easier to do everything since I've retired, and ironically, like I really miss being in the classroom. I went back part-time in the fall, and I love being back in the classroom, but I don't miss all the drama. It just would get ridiculous.
Well,
Anyway.
congratulations on on the retiring and also just on such a fascinating career and it's the fact that it's brought you to where you're at now and sharing all this stuff with us is just a blessing. And while we're on the topic of Shakespeare, shall we dive into Shakespeare for
Okay,
a minute? Because
if you want, go ahead.
Vincent had some thoughts on Shakespeare and it was interesting to recently read the Woolley biography of Dee, where
Yeah,
he actually touched on those theories
yeah.
and pretty much dismissed them all. He touched on them briefly
Hmm.
and dismissed them all except for one, which wasn't, a Dyer or a Garland theory. It was
Hmm.
a different mellow high house or high something I couldn't
I,
remember.
I, I don't. It's been a few years since I read Woolley's book. I really like Woolley's book, and I thought it was the most readable biography of Dee. Um, I mean, you could put on some of the plays as rituals, like Midsummer Night's Dream. In fact, Alan and I watched people put that on as a ritual. And you can, I think it's the Merchant of Venice. You can map that out kabbalistically. You can with Midsummer Night's Dream, and then what do you do with Prospero's book and things like that. So I mean, Shakespeare's real interesting magically. Yes, I'm sidestepping your Francis Garland question because that was a place where I did just decide, like, while I'm in the academy, I guess I'm going to shut up. I do think that Francis Garland and Dee's diary was likely, you can't prove that he wasn't Shakespeare. Now, you can't prove very easily that a lot of people weren't Shakespeare because there are years missing for Shakespeare. It's just there's no place where Francis Garland appears and and you can find Shakespeare, but you can't find Shakespeare that often. So I think I'm going to take that on in fiction after I get a couple other projects done. Because
Cool.
yeah,
Well, that would be fun.
that's what I think. That's what I could argue that for a long time, but there I don't get much traction with it with academics. In fact, the Edward Kelley wrote a poem that winds up in the first English translation of Ripley's Compound of Alchemy in 1591. But then Ashmole reprints this poem. It's to GS gentlemen like Guillaume Shakespeare, which is something they do with it. And it all seems to me about creating a magical theater. But even with that, I know that people who even bother to speculate who that GS is come up with someone who I find totally improbable. But it's another whole thing. So I'll just stick
Yeah.
with the magic in Shakespeare and the occult in Shakespeare, and we can just believe that this guy who supposedly never left England, but he knows all these things that a spy would know about Italy, about France. He seems to, even the one that he has set in Prague, where Dee and Kelley were, of course, people have used to say, well, that's the Winter's Tale, where there's a comment about the Bohemian coast. And they're like, well, see, he doesn't know anything about Bohemia. until someone pointed out, well, actually, this shows he knows a lot about medieval Bohemia because it once did have a coast and no longer did at that time. And so you can do all sorts of things with that, but I think I'll fight battles that are easier to win for a while.
For sure. The question I guess I've always thought that made sense is like if where I mean, we could phrase it in terms of Dee. If Dee and if Dee didn't teach Shakespeare this stuff, who did? Where
Yeah,
did Shakespeare learn what Shakespeare knew? And I know that
exactly.
I recently there's been a big push to say that there was no sign of any historical person ever existing such as Shakespeare. But that
Mm. But
some
that's
I listened to I listened to some of the arguments, but then I promptly, reading I was reading Woolley at the time, so it's like
yeah.
people were taking out newspaper articles because Shakespeare owed them money. Like that wasn't something you generally could do with someone who wasn't known, right?
You're
Like
talking about that great court case, right? That there's a whole book just on that court case about the Shakespeare the Renter. That one, is that what you're talking about?
I just know the reference from reading Woolley, briefly,
Okay.
but
Oh, it must be another one. Well, so we could just go nuts with this in terms of everything you could do with Shakespeare and Dee and Kelley. And this is why there is this, you know, this is shifting in history and shifting rapidly, one hopes. But there is the idea that because, like, look, I find that it was written down here, it must be true. It's like, no, people write things down that aren't true, especially people who are in intelligence or who are working with double meanings, like the whole D being a 007 thing. That came from Richard Deacon, which was a pen name of a guy who was a buddy of Ian Fleming, the James Bond guy, right?
yeah.
And so they're like, Dia's signature is 007. And I remember with that looking in, not just me, and being like, no, there's no 007. So let's imagine, for example, that governments then, just like now, can manufacture an identity for you. Well, that explains a lot of things about Sir Edward Kelley. You have someone who's useful, who's compromised, and you offer them another identity. Well, are you going to send your other intelligencers or your couriers abroad? There's all these Garland brothers, and there's also a very famous painting. The It's a Dürer painting, and it winds up in Prague, Festival of the Rose Garland. But if you go back in art history, there are Garland brothers that are people. This is proto-Rosicrucianism, okay?
Yeah.
But it is very very much like Rosicrucianism. So they're brothers like in some kind of initiatory group that shares a common philosophy. And so if you look in Dee's diary, there's all these Garland brothers. Well, when Edward Garland, who's probably Edward Dyer, says, he arrives with Francis Garland, it's not like they're biological brothers or adopted brothers. They're brothers Garland of some group that is committed to some principle that I would argue turns into Rosicrucianism. But anyway, so I had a fun time in the early aughts going through and writing my scandalous history of who is really who with D, like, and who gets married for color and what kids are really the kids of some noble. You can have all kinds of fun with that with Shakespeare too, because people have made much of Shakespeare's two marriages and all that. Well, what that kind of reeks of is somebody being married for color because some nobleman has gotten some woman pregnant. And then you can have all sorts of fun with, like, what if that person is Edward Talbot? Why is Edward Kelley? He shows up as Edward Talbot, and then we assume that Edward Kelley is the same person. Well, then why was Dee writing down Edward Talbot? And Edward Talbot was from a very important noble family. So you don't want to just kind of lie and, like, well, I think I will write down that this is Robert Kennedy or something. I mean, we don't really have the same kind of thing to pick and choose from now. But so how does Edward Talbot suddenly turn into Edward Kelley? So a friend of mine figured, okay, well, let's see. Let's look at all the things that this noble dude, Edward Talbot, does. Okay, suppose he's the one that gets this woman pregnant and this woman gets married off to Shakespeare. Okay, that matches there. Then we got to find something for Shakespeare to do. Okay, he'll be a courier and he's married this person for color. And you can do this with lots of people. Now, you can't prove any of it. What it does is make a sort of steamy novel where no one, if you're not a noble, your kids aren't your own. But anyway.
I do
Um,
I do think there hasn't been nearly enough novels written about the things we love in this time period. So the esoteric aspects of it. There's probably been way too many in Elizabethan period novels, probably,
yeah,
but
well,
not on the stuff that I would want to see. And there's been some, but I think there could be more, especially with the constant new information that we keep seeming to discover. Have you considered, for example, I always thought of Freemasonry as a later development, but now that I'm aware that the first Freemasonic call started in Scotland in the 1490s, if I'm
yeah,
remembering
I've
right.
I've heard about that. Yeah, I
So,
don't know. Yeah.
like, I'm not saying that Dee and Rosicrucianism came from Freemasonry at all, but Freemasonry and Rosicrucianism do have a relationship that developed
Mhm.
at some point, if not in the inception. But it points to me to the existence of these kinds of organizations, which is
Mhm.
not news. And since it's not news to us, the question for me has always been like which ones directly influenced Dee, if any. And then there's the whole rising up of the night school around Dee's time as well. That
Yeah.
I'm not too sure how much he was involved in that, but if you're aware of anything about Dee's
The
potential education, you mentioned that you don't know if we had a secret teacher, but there it seems like there might have been well, the night school is a good example.
yeah. Well, okay, so the person who I think, if you like fiction, who has fictionalized that the best is Deb Harkness, who is a leading D scholar, and so she has this whole setup in her All Souls trilogy where this history professor is going over old manuscripts in the Bodleian and so on, and it's also a vampire love story, and I get really, really tired of vampire love stories. But having said that, like the history is just awesome. In fact, I was moderating a John Dee Yahoo group. This was back in the day, and I'm like reading this book, and I'm like, wait a minute, she's putting in fiction here all the stuff I was going to put in an article, and we were having a great discussion about it. So look at her fictional account of the School of the Night, and you'll get a really nice tapestry of that. And so, yeah, Dee is involved. He's not central to it. There's the best scholarly book on Dee is probably Glenn Perry's Archconjurer of England. But the
I'm
thing
waiting
that,
for it to arrive. 3 month
yeah,
waiting list to get it shipped.
well, well, I'll tell you, it's wonderful all the way up to the point where the Enochian stuff starts. And I mean, Perry's not that interested in the monad, so I mean, don't read it to understand the monad. But
No.
but the early stuff with Dee, it's like apparently Dee was married 3 times. Apparently, he was an unmarried a married Catholic priest. I mean, there's just fantastic stuff in there. But then you get to the stuff in Prague with Kelley, and it's like when reading it, I thought, geez, I know what happened. This was awesome. To a much lesser degree, the same thing, in my humble opinion. I mean, she's a much better scholar than I'll ever be, but the same thing happens with Deb Harkness's fiction. It's like she's cranking along, and she gets to the stuff in Prague, and it let's say it's not her best work, and she's a really good writer up to that point. She also doesn't like Kelley too much, and I hear you said you've been to Kelley's tower, so she does set Kelley in Kelley's tower. She doesn't do the usual kind of historian thing of saying, well, we have no evidence that Kelley ever lived there, but of course it's fiction, she doesn't have to have evidence anyway. So
Well,
what brought you to Kelley's tower, by the way? Could I ask that?
yeah. First of all, I will say her Deb's novels sound Dr. Harkness's novels sound better than more interesting to me than the TV show, which my mother and sister did force me to watch. Let's say once. I'll go with
Yeah.
once. I would never could. Anyway, it was actually fun. I did enjoy it sort of, but I was disappointed by the Elizabethan stuff and like
Yeah, well, the stuff in Prague was, so all of that is like taking place in Prague Castle, which, since you've been there, I mean, what an crazy, incredible place. But I guess they can't film that, so they stick this out in some hunting shed or something that makes no sense. Anyway,
yeah, first time I went to Kelly's Tower, and we're talking about the above the Calixer Cafe, that's the bar that's there now. I don't
yeah,
think it was there when I first went in 2007 or
mm,
six. I was just wrapping up. I had just started my doctoral program with Nicholas Goodrick Clark, and
yeah,
he had just finished his transition over to Exeter because when I signed on with him, he was at Lampeter in Wales still. And I met him at the ASE in East Lansing, Michigan in 2003. So I was really gearing up for that and trying to figure out if I could go full time or part time, funding, all of that sort of thing. Don't worry, it all fell apart in the recession, and then he died, so I
Oh,
didn't get to.
that's hard.
Yeah, it's been a rough one. But I did that first time go to Kelley's Tower and saw the found it because of the alchemical museum aspect,
Oh
and
yeah.
and they were advertising that in Prague. So that's how I went to there the first time. I would go, I spent the day there and then at some of the other alchemical exhibits around Prague the first time. And then I didn't get to go back until 2019. And when I was there, and so I was very well aware that but again, I really look forward to you filling in some of the gaps on this since it's kind of Vincent's baby, right? That
Oh
place.
yeah.
Yeah, and I
Oh,
didn't know
he,
that even when I was there, and working with the staff there to put on a series of lectures, including an all-night ritual I did in the basement.
oh,
And
you did? Oh, I would love
oh
to hear
yeah,
about that. So we couldn't do something in the basement, and in that time, was it in 2019 or 2007 you did
2019,
that?
yeah, February
Oh,
2019.
awesome. So there was supposed, I mean, the people who had been there when Vincent was there, and the person who tells this story the best is a guy named Zach, who actually I tell some of Zach's stories, and Vincent had a book on Kelley. It's just the Alchemical Enigma,
Yeah, I've
but
been
I
trying to
wrote
get that for
so
years.
in there. Oh, yeah, and so they were sure there was something in the basement, along with it being a crypt and a wine cellar and all of that. And that basement is wild. I mean,
You could
but I
fit an
wanted to do a
entire
ritual.
Golden Dawn temple in there, an
Yeah,
entire vault, and then
yeah.
have still that same. You still have twice as much space left. You could do amazing retreats there. And they actually were very kind to me and rented me the facilities for free.
Yeah. Well, that
Um,
they
they
were
double
gonna let
booked
us sleep.
me actually in the theater, and that's why they gave me
Yeah.
the basement free because they double
Oh,
booked me in the theater. So I had to do my lectures in the restaurant, and that was a hassle. Anyway, they're wonderful people, and I recommend people go do events there as much as they can because it's Prague, it's beautiful, and it's affordable.
yeah, exactly. And it's I mean, they were gonna let us, we wanted to sleep in the attic because Vincent was sure that that was where Kelly's Enochian temple was, and I think he was right for a variety of
Hello.
kind of kind of wild reasons. So we wanted to spend the night in there, but it that never came to pass. We had to go, but we did the year after Vincent died. I got to do a pretty major Enochian ritual in the tower. And the way we worked that then was that at that time, so there was supposed, I mean, the people who had been there when Vincent was there, and the person who tells this story the best is a guy named Zach, who actually I tell some of Zach's story. There was a restaurant that you could pay extra and they would have like these romantic dinners and you could eat up in the tower. So Vincent's fiance, Elishka, um, found out about this because she's from Prague, and so she booked it. So they came and served us this romantic dinner. But then the idea was you could stay there as long. Now I thought we didn't particularly need to hide what we were doing, but then I'm not from Prague, and she had she was. So, but I'm sure that some things were done in that tower because it's on such an energy point. And what Vincent thought was, if you know, when you're up in the tower, you look down and there's this whole sloped area and there's kind of a parabolic energy flow through there, and it hits, if you're projecting, it runs through the tower and then you can kind of hit the focus point of the parabola below. So that was his whole theory about it. But boy, it was one of the like the rushes of my life doing Enochian up there. But
Wow.
so how did things go in that in the I stepped on your story. I
No,
apologize.
not really. I love it. It's so cool to hear this. I mean, they had the museum part that they've set
Mhm.
up to look sort of like his thing, and they have Dee there, and they tell you Dee worked there with him, but I don't think that was true, right?
No, no,
No.
it's
And of course, I sort of got a little infamy out of commenting in my early reviews of the in my early stage of the podcast and a bit before that. I noticed that in the setup there, they had a little
yeah,
garden, but the only thing
yeah.
growing in the garden in the setup. Do you know what it was?
No, but I pot probably.
It's mushrooms. The only
Really?
thing growing in the garden. I asked the tour guide, this young little blonde girl who knew a lot about the place. Actually, she had surprisingly good knowledge of things.
Yeah.
And she said that was their garden so that they could have food to eat while they were doing their work up here. I'm like, and I was like, okay, that's the first thing she said that sounds kind of daft to me.
Mm.
The idea that like they need food, like the stairwell is it's decent. It's a decent stairwell. You wouldn't
It's
want
a
to go up
cool
and down it
stairwell. Yeah,
nonstop, but it's not anything crazy, especially
yeah,
if you ever lived in a top floor of a Berlin apartment building. Like
yeah.
those stairs will kill you.
Well,
Um, and
no, I think
and I
that's
was
an
like,
all. That's yeah,
they don't need a garden to eat, right? They have servants. They have people who bring
yeah,
them food. And if it is a garden to eat, why in your diorama do you have only mushrooms?
yeah. That makes
Someone
no
did
sense at
something
all.
there, and so that
Well,
made me
it,
speculate on D. Kelley and entheogens, and of course,
yeah. Well, that's what I would speculate on. That Kelley was.
and that led me
Yeah, that's
to some comments that my friend Chris Bennett did in his work Liber 420 recently,
yeah.
and he directed me to the work of his buddy P.D. Newman, who then a
Mhm,
couple years later put out Angels in Vermilion and explores
mhm.
the data's there, but can be
Yeah,
hard to isolate the key data that P.D. Newman is presenting. Both him and Chris Bennett are very clear about the fact that as research on psychedelia and history, they're not
hmm,
academic researchers. They're trying to just gather data and present it so that people can explore it, very much sort of in the journalistic approach that Graham Hancock allegedly takes.
yeah,
Just like
yeah,
I can't vet all of this, but here it is.
yeah,
Here's a lot of
yeah.
unpublished information. Please vet it. And of course, the response is most people just laugh at these folks. But what they're doing, I think, is incredibly valuable because they're just saying, here's information no one's considering. What do you think? And most of the and I think that is
Right.
the question that we have with Dee and Kelley when it comes to drugs, a word that only appears once in their diary
Hmm,
entries, and is referenced and made much ado about
hmm.
by people like my friends Chris Bennett and P.D.
Yeah,
Newman. I will say though, I was saving this for my book. I will
yeah.
say, my dear friends Newman and Bennett, one thing you didn't notice about the occurrence of drugs in Dee's diary that I wish they had noticed, and saying it to
Yeah.
you is just as good about, as revealing it in my
Yeah.
upcoming book. You didn't notice, brothers, if you had looked at the key source material, you would have noticed not only is that reference there, but it happened on April 20th.
Ah. Well,
So how cool is that? And a reminder
that's
that if you go to your source documents, you may get to make marijuana jokes even better.
oh, you can well, I'll throw something out there since they're researching it and I don't want to follow this anymore, but I ran across something about hemp traffic in that time. You know where it came from was Hungary. And then you run into that sort of the batteries and all that gets very creepy. But Dee supposedly went to Hungary, but no one can show when. Now, I have no reason to think that Dee was anything but rectitudinous, but I have no, it's like, why are you going to write things down? Is somebody going to write down in a place where there is something they shouldn't be doing that they're doing it? I mean, of course not. That's just totally absurd. Now, um, Vincent, who since he is deceased, I can say, took really enjoyed the liberal attitude towards marijuana in Prague, and he was sure that in that time period that there was, let's say, that there was traffic from North Africa through Hungary into Prague. But there is another reason in that time period where it's not going to get written down, and that's because you're crossing religious lines. I mean, there's ongoing fights between the Holy Roman Empire and the Ottoman Turks. So of course no one is going to write this kind of thing down, or they may hedge at it. But then you have all the things in Dee's diary where you've got the still going, and Kelley is just kind of, it appears he's getting kind of tanked off of the spirits of the wine. And that's where you get some of the things that it's not in the one thing that I wrote two articles on because I was just so fascinated by what was going on there, where um, and it's leading up to their infamous wife swapping thing. But anyway, Dee and Kelley are not sitting at the scrying stone, and Kelley is asking questions, receiving answers, transmitting it to Dee. No, what is happening is he's been in the distillery with the spirits of wine, sees this guy
Ben,
spirit of Ben, and comes back and tells Dee, And rather than Dee saying something like, "We need to sober you up, buddy," Dee listens and the whole thing just starts spiraling. Yeah, you know the part that I'm talking
Oh, I
about. I
love
mean,
it.
it's a fascinating section, and it's where a lot of things turn right in that section. Anyway,
Yeah,
but I digress.
the little spirit of Ben. I just like to
Yeah.
imagine this little gnomish guy. But and Ben is an interesting word.
Yeah.
It's such a key word in Hebrew,
Right.
and therefore Islam as well and stuff. But but it's also that sounds like such a colloquial name. It seems like the least magical name ever, despite being an abbreviation of a tribe of Israel,
Yeah.
right? But just so wild. It reminds me of like one of my favorite Kelley stories is when he's trying to get the manuscript to show to the Jesuits who because he's really falling
Hmm.
in love with the Jesuits, which is what leads me to think he wasn't really a Catholic priest before he met Dee. If at all, though I again I'm not the expert, but he really fell in love with the Jesuits in Poland and then still more further in Prague, it seems, and wanted to show them the page. And Dee had to lock him in the room, or he locked Dee in the room to try and get the pages to show the Jesuit
Yeah.
from the diary. But then the servants stop him and get Dee out of his locked room, and Dee says to Kelley, "Let's ask the spirits if you should do that." And Kelley scries with the spirits, and he's like, "No, they won't let me," which is so wild because
So
most
you
people
have to,
are so
but
committed to the idea that Kelley was making this all up. It's like,
well, or that Dee always tells the truth. I mean, do we really know that
right, of course.
happened? Because the whole backdrop in Poland, there is so much, and this is actually something that I've been working on with some other things for quite a while. And in Vincent's book on Kelley, all right, Vincent died not having footnoted his book, which leaned a lot on many sources. And so I had went through and footnoted it. And at a certain time, I thought, well, I'm just going to write about this separately some other time. So in Poland, my point is that there are academic articles you can find looking about what, in terms of intelligence, would they be doing going to Poland and why, first of all. Second, that there is a Slavonic Enoch in one of the Jagiellonian libraries in a place they were. So that's something they'd be doing. But wait, there's more. They're staying in places where their contact is Philip Sidney, the famous Elizabethan courtier who has been there on a trip before because wealthy young men are supposed to go on these trips. So they're staying in those places. And who else is involved there that is affiliated with the Jesuits and winds up having a problem with them? Francesco Pucci, who then reappears later and seems to cause them nothing but. So when I go through that, it's like there's something else going on there. It's like there's another scene, and I apologize first of all to anyone listening that we're going into these like real minutia of Dee's diary. But there's another place where like these books are totally destroyed and then they reappear in the fireplace, you know? And it's
Well, it
like,
sounds like
well,
they fake burned them for the nuncio, right?
yeah,
That yeah,
that's yeah. So
and pretended to burn the powder too, the philosopher's stone.
yeah, which is another good question, which is like, where does Kelley get that powder if it really exists? Because I think it did exist,
The
but
main story is from that grave that they scried that there was treasure
yeah,
at, right? But P.D. Newman, that's what his whole book is about. That trip, basically.
yeah.
And who
Oh,
and
really? Oh, I got to
yeah.
get that book.
Yeah, it's great. It's challenging to read some of the ways he puts the data together, I found. But I love you,
Mhm.
brother out there. And thank you for doing the heavy lifting on that because it's going to make it a lot easier for people to now sort through the information and suss it out and see what he looks at who was making the Philosopher's Stone at that
Mhm.
time and afterward, where they learned that kind of process, how they might have learned it. And
Mhm.
he points to the fact that afterwards, it was DMT was being used as the Philosopher's Stone for a long period of
Oh.
time. So we
Mhm.
know that from the Memphis Mizraim Cagliostro rites of Masonry, which was then echoed in the Russian rites, they would give a red stone with a white
Mhm.
inhibitor, MAOI inhibitor, and
Mhm.
to the candidate going into the third. I don't want to give stuff
Yeah,
away.
no, I no,
I've not been
I'll
through
get
that
the book.
initially. I'm not a master mason, so
Yeah,
technically I'm not
yeah,
giving anything away. But like
yeah,
giving them the DMT
yeah.
ayahuasca style with an inhibitor orally to go into that initiation. And so if they were doing that not long after, he had his that's his argument. I believe I'm butchering it, but P.D. Newman's argument is this DMT was considered the Philosopher's Stone by many, many, many people
Mhm.
for several hundred years maybe it
Mm-hmm.
was by Dee and Kelley as well. That's such a reduction to the absurd of his argument and his data. I encourage people to go check out Angels in Vermilion, and I can't wait till you read that and see what you think.
Oh, well, the thing is, so the texts Dee was drawing on that are from this Greco Egyptian fusion that is the time period, like just in terms of Hermeticism, I most love. I mean, they're talking about visions all the time. I mean,
Hmm.
all the time. And I'm not saying this as, like go out and have a trip or something, but
No,
the vision of Zosimus of alchemical transformation isn't about turning lead into gold. It's about fusing with divine consciousness, which, as you know, that's what I see as the main motion in the last few theorems in the Monus Hieroglyphica. It's not turning lead into gold. And also something that gets that I think would be a kind of smoking gun and would be there if we were talking about physical alchemy is which kind of physical alchemy? As I'm sure you know, there are people in the International Alchemy Guild now, like, do you know Paul Harris, who he's a person I've talked to the most about this. But, there are people who can make the plant stone if you're talking about making the stone in the plant kingdom. If you're doing lead into gold, that's the mineral stone. So if you're going to consider the Monus Hieroglyphica any kind of physical alchemy, which, as you know, I mean, I'm not interpreting it that way, but you could interpret it if you wanted to as and I forget the person who writes on this, but as golem making, as in the
yeah,
animal kingdom. And at least if you're talking about extending life or something, well, that that would make more sense than you're creating a golem really than and bringing it to life. But
yeah,
no one even seems to get into that discussion. Like, what kind of alchemy are we talking about? And then when you get into the Enochian work, well, when they're told what the Great Table of Earth contains, they're told it contains formal alchemical transmutation. So, like, what kind are you talking about? I think if you're in that kind and you're claiming, as Kelley claimed to do and has was witnessed by a lot of people, not just Dee, to be turning something into silver or gold, you've got another problem, which is you're going to get locked up and people are going to say, okay, make it for me now, which is, you know, not optimal. I
yeah.
just think.
Yeah,
Uh,
Kelley in and out in prison big time over that with Rudolph, right? Whether either
mhm.
because he didn't want to give him the secret or didn't have it,
Yeah.
whatever you want to believe, I suppose. But it's interesting that in the Woolley biography, he makes it very clear Kelley didn't die. Well, actually, I mean, I guess can't make it very clear, but it seems like Kelley left Bohemia eventually and continued down south with his family, according to Woolley. But I like the version. I think it was you mentioned of him losing. Was it you that mentioned him losing both his legs eventually?
People,
Yeah.
I mean, I went to where I think he died and where
Okay.
I think Thomas Kelley, who I think Thomas Kelley winds up back in England, but in most, that's where he was in prison. They have a whole Edward Kelley museum there. They've got an Edward Kelley statue. I got my picture taken with the Edward Kelley statue and all that. I mean, I went to where I think he died and where kind of stuff, but I mean, and I went and looked at um, the history of the Kelley family after Kelley dies, and I think it's very clear that he dies in most. But I mean,
Okay.
I may be. The other thing is then you have the whole bit of Kelley's family, and how do they get there, and who are they anyway? Because there are some manuscripts that C.H. Jostin finds in the British Library a couple generations ago, where there are references to Dee and Kelley and their wives, and their families, but that seems to have been taken out of the rest of the diary because what you get the rest of the time is this bit of Dee and his family and Kelley and his wife, um, and Thomas Kelley, his brother. So um, why why doesn't Dee mention that Kelley's kids are around? And that's been pretty conclusively shown. Like the guy Hammond who shows up in Dee's diary, um, Kelley's stepdaughter is writing to him, and she refers to Hammond as someone who was her Latin tutor, which is kind of fascinating. But I mean, Elizabeth Weston and her brother are never ever mentioned by Dee, even though her letters refer to Dee and refer to Dyer and people like that. Not in great length, but enough to know. I mean, that's how they figured out that's who that person was.
Wow.
So that's all interesting.
Do you have
Uh,
any ideas why he omitted such stuff?
I just have my kind of tabloid level theories about it. I would say that part of So if I were to write a novel about it, what I would do is make Kelley's wife one of these marriages for color of someone like, I don't know, a Robert Devereaux or someone like that and these kids that are being taken along. Because if you go look at Michael Wilding, who is from the same place in England that Kelley allegedly was, um, went and looked at all the church rolls there. Um, and then he went, there's a record in Chipping Norton where supposedly Kelley's wife was from. And they're real old records, but they're old and out of place records, if that makes sense. It's not like someone put a new record in there, but it is like the record from long ago is kind of sketchy looking. So I think they're not referred to because there's some illegitimate kids of someone and they need to be gotten out of there. If like their father is Protestant, and the mother is Catholic, well, that's a problem. And Joan Kelley herself is this really fascinating person if you go and look at stuff in the archives, because unlike any other supposedly English person in that time period who is over there, she's writing in Czech. Like
Hmm.
Czech's not as you know, it's not an easy language to write in. So one could say, oh, well, this is by the time after Kelley died. Well, she's learned Czech. Well, first of all, most of the records are in Latin, and if they're not in Latin, they're in German. So yeah, she could have learned Czech and she probably would have learned Czech, but the only reason I could see that she would be writing in Czech is if that's a language she's kind of comfortable with. And but anyway, that's just a speculation far afield. But um, I do know that an interesting thing happened since I traced those two kids the most that I could, probably because I needed a better hobby. But okay, so the son winds up first being put in a like a Catholic boarding school when he's like kindergarten age, and it's the same one associated with a Father Campion, who is a priest who is drawn and quartered in England. So, but he's in this Catholic school.
Hmm.
Um, then later on, he gets sent to, I think, Wittenberg, which I think that's the right place. It plays a prominent part in Hamlet. But then, so Elizabeth Weston, when people figure out that her poetry is that she's the step that this poet is the stepdaughter of Kelley, then what they there were a couple very wonderful and well-meaning articles where they're like, well, see all the freedom that this person had because she was in a Catholic country because they didn't know anything else that had happened. Well, yeah, but then you find that she is basically marrying someone who appears to be an intelligencer for one of the big Protestant houses that is in what's now Germany, and they're super Protestant. So it's like, well, no, it's kind of more interesting that she's marrying this Protestant dude in Prague, actually. But
Hmm.
so the whole thing, it's the one thing that I'm certain of is something else is going on. Like the cover story is just a cover story. Anyway,
And it seems like there's many cover stories in these fellows'
yeah,
lives. So we're
yeah.
not going to get bored anytime soon, at least.
No,
I mean, the
no.
mysteries keep unfolding. It was Clay Holden that discovered, speaking of the golem and the
Yeah,
Emmet versus Moot,
yeah,
like truth versus death issue. I mean, the Y15, Y14
Yeah,
enigma
that's awesome.
is one
Yeah,
of my favorite things. It's
yeah.
probably one of most Enochian magicians' favorite things, and most people are going like, "What are they talking about now?" Even my astute audience, some of them aren't going to know what we're talking about, but
Oh, look. Yeah, that's a good thing to look up. Well, with the Enochian work, you go through and you realize that whatever one thinks about it, and I mean, I plan to keep working on that stuff till I die, really. But um, it's you take things on their at surface value at your peril. And so when you get things like, which was this was it, quite popular about 10 years ago to look at the holy table, and then there's a copy, as you I'm sure you know, in Truth and the True and Faithful Relationship, Merritt Casaubon still had access to the real holy table. So supposedly that picture of the holy table that you get there is actually Dee's holy table. And then someone noticed, well, the letters don't match up with the diary. So there were all these, well, it was a printer's error. Well, first of all, like making a printer's error like that is way more complicated than a printer's error would be. I mean, you'd have to mirror things perfect. So,
and
I
also
mean,
why
Alan,
wouldn't the
yeah.
ensigns would be reversed?
Oh, the whole, well, there, I think the argument was made by people who hadn't set type because we were, out of that era where people would work with type. But the thing is, if you go back and look in the diaries, Dee is saying, or the angels are supposedly saying this to Dee. It's one of the places where it looks like it wasn't an exact scrying session. It's written down afterwards, but they're saying, consider the transposition of letters. So you go through and you transpose the letters. And then you look at this drawing of the holy table and you figure maybe you should face east. So if you face east and then you see, why is this reversed? And anyway, if you follow the instructions there and you follow it the way a ceremonialist might, and by that I only mean that, like, you stand behind an altar and face east. It's like that's all you got to keep in mind, and then follow what's going on there. It matches perfectly. It just doesn't match a reading that where someone doesn't really engage and figure out all, you know, various things. The same thing with the way that you and this is a thing actually of the work of Alan and mine that I'm the proudest of, which is how you letter the Great Table of Earth. I mean, you're not going to find a place in the spirit diaries where you get it correctly lettered. And so that leads, as you know, to all kinds of problems like multiple lettered squares and so on. But if you look at the one manuscript that is kind of like Dee's grimoire, you get a circular drawing and then grids in a row. And so if you let the governors govern the squares, and so if there's a conflict between the letter, you figure, oh, well, the Enochian governor governs the square, so we'll get rid of this letter and put the governor in. Then not only does the whole thing match, it matches in, I mean, an eerie way where you're like, either they're having, or probably both of these, they're having some serious help on another level, and this is influenced by the structure of these men's mind that know the Monas Hieroglyphica, because what you get is the outside matching the inside. I mean, it's wild, and it matches energetically what we've experienced working with it. Once you set up a temple space that way, it just hums, and the outside rotates through the inside. Vincent would claim that that was a hypercube, and that seems to make, well, why would that be a hypercube? Well, think of theorem 20 in the monad. I don't think they would have called it a hypercube, but that's the structure that is kind of the holy grail of his mystical system. You set up this cubic space, and the outside of it connects to the inside, and it rotates through the middle, and then it just keeps running. It's really cool. Anyway, but I digress again.
No, absolutely. Your paper with Alan is what led us to make the decisions for our new table that we made. And I don't know if we've used all the letter substitutions that you made, but we were looking at the directionality, of course. And I liked that the argument. Oh, I think not only did I think it was right, but it meant it was clockwise, which instead of counterclockwise, which of course made me happy. But
Yeah,
again, I would have gone the other way if I was convinced by the other argument. And then of course Joseph Peterson came out with his new revised diagram, which confirmed exactly what a lot of us were doing, and so that was really
yeah.
nice to see. It's always good. That was wouldn't have changed anything if he had thought we were wrong, but it was nice to see that he agreed with your research. at least for the most part, right? With the
No, that was,
new if you've seen the new design he put out, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's been really, really nice, and I think we're both lucky in this, in that, in a certain way, it's a crappy era to live in. But if you're working on this stuff, I mean, you have the advantage of easy access to stuff. Like, I mean, I've got my client here. Okay, I was so happy when that came out, and there's yeah, it also is great, I guess, for oh yeah, oh nice, yeah.
Sorry, I was muted.
Oh, that's a, so. I mean, you can fix things more quickly. I mean, I remember before Klein came out, uh, going, and I looked in the British Museum, and then remember the Magical Review, and it was such a big deal that Ian Rons was putting all of those manuscripts out there, but it was still nothing like, I mean, all the cross referencing that goes on in Klein's. By the way, Kevin Klein, if you're out there, I've been trying to find out who you are for many years now. I'm one of your biggest fans. Um, please get a hold of me. You're one of my, like I said, I'm one of your biggest fans. Do
No one
you
knows
know
who he is,
if
eh?
Kevin, huh?
No one knows
No,
who this guy is.
no, I mean, I have various theories of who I think it is, because I wonder if this guy's real name. What I, but I don't want to diss someone if Kevin Klein is a real person and out there, because there is really good work that comes out and no one sees. By the way, the thing that we did in the Monad with LVX, who else? Well, that was Vincent's idea. I'm thinking of something else. I'm sorry. But Agnes Klein did a German translation of the Monad in 1980, which is just awesome. And I mean, I think that probably was her real name. I tried to find her. I don't even know if she's still alive, but I would have loved to have known um, how she found out some of this stuff. She must have gone and looked at the Codex Marcianus, because she was the one that found out that Dee had a copy of it, that Dee had left it in Kassel, and that Goethe had found it. And that set me on this whole track of looking at the works of Zosimus, or looking at Isis the prophetess to her son Horus, and
This is,
that time.
to me, one of the most important aspects of the course you presented and the research you've done is I don't even know how to approach this because I want to approach it in so many ways all at the same time. But the Codex Marcianus clearly was Dee's secret text. He didn't even
Yeah.
list it in his diary. And how much of it not being listed in his diary might have led to Dee, us believing that Dee had no interest or knowledge in the history of alchemy somehow, or spiritual alchemy, and that this, let me perhaps frame it this way. I've never had a spiritual alchemy has never been on a hill I was willing needed to die on or anything like that. It's not a peccadillos for me, but I grew
Mm-hmm.
up with it. I grew up in a Maharishi yogic family, into
Oh, yeah.
Waldorf school and into Golden Dawn, and next thing you know I was in seminary. So it's like this is the world
Yep.
I grew up in, and surely while I was doing my master's, the language of mystical Christianity, which still cause it has its roots in we all know what, but that started to replace some of the more new ageism of alchemical language that I grew up knowing. And it's been widely attacked as being just a fabrication of the new age, or perhaps at best some kind of Paracelsian pseudo terminology, but with no roots prior to
No,
that. But this seems
it's
all
like the
incorrect.
fusion. It's the
Yeah.
most cool fusion. It's like fuse the Greek learning with the Egyptian learning. There's also this bit about, like, well, why do ceremonial magicians do all this Egyptian stuff? Because clearly the Judeo-Christian tradition has no connection to Egypt. It's like, excuse me?
Yeah.
Like, did you read your own tradition? and and that's one of my pet peeves. But then you get this fusion before the Library of Alexandria, where you get multi different types of pagan ideas with Greco-Roman ideas, and then the kind of, well, yeah, you can be Jewish and Christian and pagan too, and then you can fuse with gold just like Ra every day. I mean, here's Ra rises in the dawn and sets in the evening, goes through the underworld, and there is no real evidence, they're saying now. And here I'm referring to the work of Shannon Grimes in English, but then there are a lot of people writing on this in French, where, like, there is no evidence that turning lead into gold is even a thing to the Greco-Egyptians. Now the Egyptians have a lot of gold, like King Tut's the door to his tomb is was, well, I don't know if it was a door, but anyway, there's a bunch of gold in there, but it's coloring things gold. And the house of gold down in Dendera, where the famous zodiac is, the house of gold isn't made of gold, it's stuff color gold. And as you know, like there are all these processes for like taking a copper lead alloy and making it look silver or making it look gold, but nobody's saying it is gold. The idea is for you to become gold like Ra, the sun, and merge with that divine consciousness, which then gets overlaid directly into a Christ consciousness, or, which I know even saying that sounds like a new agey term, but that's exactly what's going on there.